I didn't really want to move to Clanton, Alabama, but I didn't have much choice at the time. After having been in business for myself for 5 years in Birmingham, my company had failed and I had lost all of the investment capital available to me, so I needed a job. Then a newspaper chain offered me a job. I was recruited to be a newspaper publisher, but I would spend the first 3 years as general manager of their newspaper in Clanton, learning their operating methods. I had no idea that it would lead to the scariest experience of my life and force me to re-examine my beliefs about things that go bump in the night. For years, I kept the story to myself because most people think you're either crazy or lying when you tell them something that can't be explained. Certainly, that has this little explanation. Clanton is a small town with fewer than 10,000 people. I think it's probably 8,000 or 9,000 people at this time. Back then, it was about 7,000, if I remember correctly. It's located on I-65, about halfway between Birmingham and Montgomery. I didn't care for living in a place that small, but I was happy to have the income. I was married at the time, and so my wife, Melissa, and I started looking for a place to live. It was really hard to find houses to rent there, and the ones that were available were very expensive for some reason. So we were thrilled to find a modern 4-bedroom house priced at about half the monthly rent that everything else was getting. It was way too big for 2 people and 1 cat, but it seemed like a bargain, and it was close to my office. When we looked at the house, the basement was partially finished. It had originally just been a large open area with a concrete floor, but some of the rooms down there had been in the process of having studs and sheetrock put up. It looked odd because tools and construction material, including dried up trays of that mud-like substance used when you're hanging sheetrock, had been left there with the work halfway done. It was as though somebody had just walked out in the middle of a job. The woman showing us the house was the owner's sister, and she told us that the last renters had been living there on a lease purchase plan, and that they were planning to buy, so they were finishing the space in the basement. She said those other people, though, the other tenants, had suddenly moved out and refused to say why. We thought that was odd, but we assumed it must be because of, issues in their own lives or something. We didn't consider that it could have something to do with the house. After we moved in, some neighbors came over from across the street to meet us and welcome us to the neighborhood. The doorbell rang late one afternoon, and we went to the door. Oddly, the couple were not standing on the porch, but they had rung the doorbell and then moved back down to the ground away from the porch, leaving some gift of food like cookies or a cake on the banister of the porch. We went outside and invited them in, but they were adamant that they didn't want to come into the house. And they never came any closer, never came back up the steps to the porch, but they were friendly. We thought they were a little strange because of that, but we didn't think anything else about it. I soon started experiencing weird little things in the house. Unknown to me, Melissa was experiencing strange things of her own too, but we weren't talking about them at first. In our first week in the house, we experienced strange, unexplained noises in the night. We were scared, but we just wrote it off as a strange house, making strange noises that we weren't accustomed to. I even wrote a funny column for the newspaper about how scared we had been one night, making fun of our fear, but we weren't taking it seriously. One day, I was down in the basement where the washer and dryer were, and I saw clear as day, the word leave, 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 written on the concrete basement wall. I'm certain about what I saw, and I felt irrationally certain in that moment that it was a message from something that wanted me out of the house. But a moment later, it turned into Leanne, Leanne, in a child's writing. I thought my eyes were just playing tricks on me, so I didn't tell Melissa. I would later find out that she had had the same experience, seeing the same word, but she hadn't wanted to tell me because she thought she had imagined it too. Little things kept seeming odd about the house, but not enough to worry about. For instance, water ran constantly in pipes where there was no water running anywhere. When a friend drove down from Tuscaloosa to spend the night, something unknown cut a perfectly circular hole about 10 or 12 inches in diameter in the blanket she used while sleeping on a sofa. She was freaked out in the morning to find that. All that was left of the missing part of the blanket was some fine material, sort of like sand. No matter what I tried, I could not duplicate the process or figure out how it could have happened. And I certainly couldn't explain the perfectly round hole. Our friend felt other odd things while she was there that night, and she left vowing that she would never return to that house. After we had been there for maybe 6 months or so, our 4-year-old cat, Oliver, suddenly died of advanced cancer. He was perfectly healthy when we moved there, but he suddenly got sick and he died during surgery. The vet back in Birmingham said that his organs were completely covered with cancer, and he couldn't understand how the cancer could have developed and taken over that quickly. I had felt an odd sensation of oppression in the house almost from the beginning, but I had ignored it because I didn't believe in that sort of weirdness. But at about the same time as Oliver's death, the feeling of oppression in the house started getting stronger. I still wasn't talking to Melissa about what I was feeling because it seemed silly and I didn't want to scare her with my oddball thoughts because my thoughts sounded crazy in my own head. Then one night, while we were eating dinner, we both started feeling an overwhelming feeling of an evil presence, unlike anything I had ever felt in my life, unlike anything I've ever felt since. I cannot explain it, but it was very real. This time we talked about it. We were both totally freaked out. We were so terrified by it that we left the food on the table where it was, and we grabbed enough clothes for the night, along with the new kitten that we had adopted, and we went to a motel. We were so terrified that we were not worried in that moment about what anyone might think if they knew we were checking into a motel. All we knew is that we had to get out of that house. Something wanted us out of that house. It felt evil and it felt threatening. We discovered that the house felt safe during the day, but something happened precisely at sunset. Starting then, the house felt full of evil presences. I know that sounds crazy, but we both felt it powerfully. We stayed in the motel for several weeks. In the meantime, we were looking for somewhere to move, but we didn't tell anyone what was going on because we didn't want people to think we were going crazy. Melissa started doing some research on the area at the local historical society. I think it was at the library. The house was right next to a small old church and a cemetery that had graves going back to the 19th century. She found out from the records that there had been an old burial ground for Native Americans right next to that cemetery when it was started in the early 19th century. But the references that she found to it were vague, so it was unclear exactly where it had been. We just knew that it was right next to it. That burial ground had just disappeared over the years, and the settlers had presumably built on top of it. Could our house be located on that burial ground? It sounded like a very bad horror movie script. We didn't know what to think. I don't remember exactly when this part of the story took place, but one day when I was heading home for lunch, I saw smoke rising in the distance. My first thought was that it was our house because I had had an irrational fear of this house burning, which I've never experienced that kind of fear in any house. And I've never experienced any house fire before. But the fire turned out to be at the house across the street from us. It was the house of the neighbors who had met us when we first moved in, but who wouldn't come into the house. Their place was burning to the ground, and firefighters were there working on it. I went over to take pictures for the newspaper, and they told me that it was an intentional burn. The people who lived there had suddenly moved out without telling anyone and just given the house to the fire department to burn as a training exercise on the condition, an odd condition, that nothing was removed from the house. It had to be burned with furniture, appliances, and everything left in it. So the fire department had set it on fire and was then using certain parts of the burn to teach firefighters how to deal with certain aspects of fires. Then it was allowed to burn completely to the ground, and the rubble was left exactly where it was. The rubble was still undisturbed when we moved. We continued to live in the motel while we tried to find a place to move, but we would go to the house during the day because it felt safe then. But the moment sunset got there, something happened in ways that I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't experienced it myself. One Saturday afternoon, we were there washing some clothes, and it was getting very close to when we knew we needed to be out. The house was very long from one end to the other, and I was at one end in a bedroom, and Melissa was at the other end in the kitchen, when twilight suddenly got there as we were trying to gather up everything to leave. I don't know how to explain what happened next. I felt the house sort of tilt in a weird way, as though it physically moved. And then the spirits were back in the most powerful way I had felt them. At that moment, I distinctly heard a horse running down the hall. I was terrified, and I ran back toward the other end of the house to find Melissa. She met me about halfway through the house, coming from the other direction, and she looked scared. "Did you feel that?" she asked me. She had also heard the horse, in addition to feeling something evil right after the house moved. We got our stuff and got out. Before long, the company I was working for promoted me to publisher of a newspaper somewhere else, so we were being transferred. My 3-year training program had turned into just 9 months there, and we were very relieved to leave that house behind. After we moved out of the house, I told Melissa that I had had a constant fear of coming home and finding the house burned to the ground. She looked at me oddly and said that she had had the same fear the whole time we had been there. Every time we were gone, she had a fear that we would come home and find it burned to the ground. We nicknamed that house Hill House, after the haunted house in a scary movie from 1963 that was based on a novel called The Haunting of Hill House. That was the end of the story for a long time. Melissa and I eventually divorced, and I didn't talk to people about this story. Then, in 2008, I took a girlfriend from out of town to Clanton one night to show her the newspaper where I used to work. I also told her the story of the house, and I drove over to let her see the house that had scared me so badly. When we got to the house, though, the house was completely gone. It was as though no house had ever even been there. All that was left was the concrete of the driveway leading to where the garage had been, and the walkway that had led to the front porch. Nothing else was there. Since it had been a nice, large, modern house, there is no way it should have been torn down. I was told several years later that the house had burned down. The fears that Melissa and I had entertained about the place burning down really did come true. I can't tell you exactly what was in that house or what happened to us. I don't know what to believe because I'm a rational person who doesn't tend to believe in supernatural things that can't be explained. But I do know that in a strange way, I was glad the house was gone. It felt as though those spirits, evil or otherwise, whatever they had been, had finally reclaimed the land as their own.